begin this kitchen countertop project, the first thing we had to do was clean the countertop with TSP, trisodium phosphate. That is the best thing to use to clean it. You just dilute it in some warm water and using a sponge, wipe it up, get it really clean, scrub anything that looks really dirty. And then after that, you want to just rinse with warm water. Next step was to sand. And I have to say, this was the most time-consuming part of the project. We have a concrete overlay over a tiled counter, and when I troweled it, there were highs and lows, obviously, in a concrete troweled look. So I had to really focus on sanding and knocking that down. It's not totally smooth, it didn't have to be, but it needed to be close to even. Now I used a 60 grit sandpaper, and in these small areas I just used the paper by hand. And it's very important to round those edges of your counter. Epoxy wants to have surface tension, so it doesn't need to be 90 degree. It needs to be slightly rounded on the top edge and the bottom edge. We doubly protected the floor with both a non-skid drop cloth and then covered that with ram board. The back wall is also covered with 3mm plastic, I believe. We used the delicate purple tape on the walls and our trim to try to keep from peeling the paint off. And then we made a cocoon to try to keep the sanding dust down. And those are called zip walls, real easy to use. Now I am wiping the countertop down to get rid of the dust. You can use alcohol. What I have here is XIM bonding primer. Now normally you would not need to use this on a porous surface like concrete, but you know that overlay's been there since 2007, and it was pretty difficult over here on this bar anyway to get all of the shiny product coating, the top coat, off. So that concerned me. Plus, in a few places right on the edge, it was chipped or sanded down to a little bit of the tile. And I wanted to make sure I had a very good bond, so this was just an extra precaution. Took about 2 hours for that to dry, and now I am ready to put on Stone Coat Epoxy's undercoat. It comes in white and black, and I chose to use the white for this finish. This too doesn't take very long to dry, about 2 hours, and even while it's still tacky, you can go ahead and apply your second coat. Well, it's the next morning and it's time to pour. I have mixed my epoxy and I have mixed all of my colors in these little cups and then poured them in my dirty pour. If you want to know my exact recipe, the previous video where I made my sample shows you exactly what I did. But in the next video, when we do the kitchen countertops, I will also be detailing it in a lot of detail. So what I'm doing now is emptying out the existing epoxy out of all my little color cups onto the counter. I need to kind of grease the board, so to speak, so that the epoxy will flow. It wants to have surface tension, and you need to have a coat of epoxy down on your countertop or whatever surface you're covering when you're doing a dirty pour. So that's what I'm doing here. This is very sticky stuff. I probably need to get my glasses tightened because they keep wanting to fall off. Randy's also emptying the rest of the epoxy out of the clear bucket that I had mixed in originally. So now that that's done, I'm just using that big popsicle stick to smear and smooth it all around on the entire surface, making sure I get all of the edges and in all of the corners. So here we go. I have 2 buckets of my dirty pour mixed up, and I'm starting to pour the first one. Now what Randy is doing back there is holding that original bucket that I used to mix my epoxy in, and he's trying to catch the drips, because when you do a dirty pour, you kind of want to start off the edge and go off the edge, and I didn't want all of that wasted and going right on the floor because I was going to need to use some of that mix. Y'all, this is so fun to do. It's really not that hard if you get a really good prep and you follow the steps. It's a lot of fun to play with. I have several other project ideas in mind that I will be sharing, of course. Randy giving me direction, making sure I was turning my veins a little bit more. I was getting a little bit too straight. I spread out the first bucket all the way across the bar top there, and now I'm using the second bucket to fill in between. Now I am using my heat gun to heat up the epoxy so that it will start to really move. It's amazing what that heat gun does. If you hold it straight up, you are basically opening up the epoxy. If you hold it to one side or the other, then you're pushing those veins around. But right now I'm just trying to get it warmed up enough and popping the bubbles so that it can do its thing for a little while. After using the heat gun initially, I am looking now for little areas of surface tension where the epoxy just doesn't seem to want to flow. So all you have to do is dab your finger in it, heat it up again, and it will start to move and cover those areas. Now in this area next to our trim, there seemed to be, well, missing epoxy a little bit, so I was trying to heat that up and move it toward the trim, toward the base. Now here I'm using a popsicle stick to kind of move the epoxy by hand. Kind of rearrange those lines and colors that were next to the base there. And adding and dropping a little bit of extra epoxy. Same thing here. As it was flowing, it was pooling up against my taped dam, and so I was picking up extra and dabbling it where it was a little thin in certain spots. At this point, it's time to just let the epoxy sit and move and do its thing. We had our house on about 73, 74 degrees. Randy thought it would be fun to do a time lapse and just let the camera record so you could see the movement over the 30-minute period. I'm not sure the video showed it very well, but it was moving. So at this point I had used the heat gun again and untaped the dam of tape that we had on the edge. And at this point, as it was dripping, I was scraping underneath and picking up and putting on more and putting in also into the bucket. Now I'm working on the other side of the bar and pulling the tape, and I didn't want to lose any of that product because I needed to lubricate the sides. So as I pulled the tape, I was scraping with a popsicle stick and rubbing the edges to coat them, so that would help that epoxy to flow over the edge. As you can see, as I was pulling the tape, I was spreading out the epoxy with the popsicle stick, sometimes with my fingers, to get some on that edge. Again, epoxy wants to have surface tension, and you need to have some epoxy on the edge to help it to flow from over the top down the sides. Well, it's the next day. Two things I neglected to film that you need to do while the pour is curing is keep wiping the bottom underside edge, catching those drips. You can use a popsicle stick, you can use your finger, and I probably did that over the course of the first 5 hours of the pour several times. Also, you have to pull your tape when it's really tacky and starting to set up. Otherwise, you'll have your tape epoxied to your wall and your trim. So here I am re-taping again with the delicate tape, getting ready for the flood coat. The next step in the process to prep for your flood coat is to sand your epoxy with 220 grit. You need to do that to give it some bite for the epoxy to cling to. Around the corners, again, I was just using a 220 pad to carefully sand next to the edge. To clean off that dust, I am using acetone. I was out of alcohol, so acetone works easily as well. I've mixed up my product, and now I am pouring it down in the center of the counter. Now, even though I mixed it in the bucket for the 2 minutes, it's also helpful to use this notched trowel, 1/8-inch notched trowel that I bought from Stone Coat, and mix it again on your countertop. You want to make sure it's well mixed so that you don't end up with any sticky spots. So that's what I'm doing here, just moving it back and forth. Using my hands now to coat the edges. Now I'm chopping it with a chop brush that is angled. I'll show you that in more detail in the next video when we do the remaining countertops. And here comes the heat gun again. With all that mixing and stirring and chopping, the chopping gets rid of your trowel lines, but with all of that, it does stir up a lot of air bubbles. So you got to get those out. Heat does it. Over the course of the first 2 hours of it curing, I used the heat gun about 3 times. This is the 3rd time, getting all of those air bubbles out, heating up that epoxy a little bit and letting it continue to flow over the edges. At this point, I very carefully pulled the tape. And again, used a popsicle stick to wipe those drips from the underneath side of the counter there.